first of all, let me quickly introduce myself. So my name is Ahmed. I'm working as a product manager at Zalando now for like 2.5 years. I was previously focused on building the infrastructure in our marketplace business, but I've just very recently moved to another team that does stuff like chatbots and kind of with the Google Assistant, so some like of this cutting edge stuff, trying to engage our customers for Zalando on these kind of new platforms. So if you're interested in this stuff, or interested to learn about what Zalando is doing there, like reach out to me. But just to give you some background about like myself before starting there, so I came here to Berlin. I had a startup before that in Egypt for 3 years. I'll talk about that more. But I had a background in computer science and did some engineering stuff with companies like IBM too. So quite a diverse background. And but today I'll speak more about my startup journey and some lessons that I learned and some failures I faced. And maybe like if you want to start a startup in the Middle East one day, why not? And maybe you learn something from this presentation. But basically, so if we go back to 2011, I was working at IBM and I was quite bored because I figured out that if I stay at the same place for 20 years, I can do the same job and kind of retire there, but I probably won't grow or learn much. So I was like kind of like wanting to change. I also like was reading these blogs and TechCrunch, and believe it or not, in Egypt we did read TechCrunch at that time. And so I was like, startups, people can make money, you can solve a problem, you can build your own product. So I kind of like was kind of like looking for the next thing to do. And at that time, the Arab Spring came. So it was 2011, you see like all these revolutions, and there was a huge belief that you can do anything, right? We can change everything, you can really succeed. And there was also at that time a lot of like seed investors and accelerators popping up. So I kind of quit my job in the middle of the revolution, kind of like joined one of these accelerators, raised some money from some angel investors. Also Vodafone had a fund at that time to fund Egyptian startups, so I raised some money from them. And we started like a small company. It was really kind of a new experience to me. We started doing some consulting around smart TVs, which also were the hype at that time with Samsung. But I figured out I don't want this to be a consulting company. I didn't leave my job to kind of become also kind of like a slave in many ways to a client. So I said, I did my product, which was called UserTalk, a small SaaS product for small businesses to communicate with each other. It showed some potential, but by that time the Arab Spring was turning into a bit of an Arab nightmare. So it's like you had this huge security situation in Egypt and kind of the economy wasn't going quite right. So I figured it was time for me kind of like to have a new adventure and jumped ship to Germany in a way or another. So that's kind of in a nutshell my experience. But the most important thing is not what I did, is what I learned about the Middle East kind of during that time. And I will try to avoid being stereotypical, but if you think about the Middle East startup ecosystem, it's a lot like a desert. And the reason that you see so is there's a lot of scarcity, right? So there is like very little resources that you have as an entrepreneur to build your business there. It's really hard to grow a successful business there. The resources are limited, and think of like building a business in the Middle East is like growing a tree in the desert, right? It takes a lot of effort, a lot of patience, a lot of dedication and investment for that to happen. So just keep that in the back of your mind. And the reason for that, like there are multiple reasons why it's hard. And one of them is if you think about the purchasing power in the Middle East, right? So the country I come from, Egypt, which has about half of all the Middle East population, Pew Institute did the research in 2015 and said like 75% of the people earn less than $10 a day. So this is a very low purchasing power of your customers. It's very hard to sell something to someone when all they are really thinking about is like how do they kind of get their food, the place to live in, the education. So they're really focused on like the core needs of life, and it's really hard to kind of build the business that caters to this kind of population. There's also like another challenge is basically technology adoption is not also like kind of cutting edge. So people there, not all of them have the latest iPhones. Most of them might not have or have smartphones, and probably they're the low-end Android ones. It's also difficult if you're doing enterprise or doing B2B to sell your kind of solution to our own organization, because that organization is probably not sophisticated, not ready, or will just go buy from corporate sellers. So it's really hard, like the adoption of technology and kind of like you thinking of building new kind of tech solutions, it's really hard to sell something new. But it's not also only about like the adoption of the technology, it's also about the infrastructure. So some of the internet speeds in the Middle East countries are among the slowest of the world. You didn't have like the infrastructure. You don't have things that you really take for granted here in Berlin, like, okay, having a logistics service like DHL to kind of ship your stuff. You don't really have kind of like a payment provider like Stripe or Aiden here to do that. So it's really difficult, right? And I sometimes muse, it's like, if I build Zalando in the Middle East, like how would you scale that? A lot of things that we build the whole infrastructure around, logistics, free returns, and payment isn't there, at least for many of the countries in the Middle East. So there's a lot of infrastructure missing and a lot of technology kind of adoption that's not there yet. And of course, you get affected by the whole geopolitical environment. So I mentioned how the kind of Arab Spring affected people in Egypt, the economic situation, but also you see it still today, even so there's like in the Gulf, I think, with different countries kind of not on good terms together. And believe it or not, that affects business, right? Because if you're in a business and you want to grow and scale, it's really hard to kind of like be affected by these surprising geopolitical situations that happen kind of randomly. And I mean, funding, when I try to find a kind of like visual for this slide, I kind of found this clip art which kind of illustrated. It's really difficult to raise funding in the Middle East, at least in my experience. And the reason is like there are, first of all, very few investors. So you don't find the number of like investors which you can pitch, but also a lot of them aren't really sophisticated. So a lot of people who have the money to invest don't understand what it means to invest in a high growth technology business. So it's really difficult to kind of like build a business plan, try to convince someone this is like, where's your assets? Like, are you taking this money just to hire a bunch of guys like and build some software? Like I'm used to invest in land or buying some physical assets. So it's a really a big challenge to raise funding in the Middle East. And I mean, this point could be discussed. So we see a lot of Middle East talent coming here, but actually there is a kind of vacuum of talent around specific roles. So there are not really a lot of people experienced in doing UX, in doing product in the Middle East. So it's really difficult. A lot of the talent is now migrating out of the Middle East, and we see a lot of Egyptians now in Berlin. So it's really hard to kind of find that talent. And even if there's talent, they also usually have the option of going to the corporate path, which is more stable and more kind of. So it's really difficult for you to just get the money, find the infrastructure, and get the people to join you on that journey. I mean, this made me feel for a lot of times that there was like a lot of times where you as an entrepreneur felt you were part of a costume party, right? And this is where you feel like the whole system was really immature, that you like talk to an investor, but he's not really an investor, right? He doesn't invest, he just talks. And I don't know if this happens in Berlin or not, but you like meet people who's like kind of a mentor in an event, and then you discover that this guy never kind of started his own business. He's just like a marketing guy in a big company. So there aren't really these role models and kind of like these success stories where you can see and you say, yes, I've seen this, and yes, I want to give back to the community. It's really difficult, and I hope I wasn't bleak. So now I've kind of discovered the story. I think the question everyone is asking himself is like, is this what you're going to tell us, that everything is dark? I think on the other side, and what we're seeing now has changed, is there are many opportunities happening in the Middle East. And I think if you look at all the constraints I mentioned and kind of like the lack of resources, the lack of funding, the lack of opportunities, this leaves a lot of vacuum for people with real solutions to come in, right? So if you think about it, there is no N26 in the Middle East, although in my country alone, there are millions of people without a bank account. So there are all these opportunities out there just because of the vacuum left by this difficulty. If you have the patience and if you have kind of the dedication, you can really capture a market without real competition. And we're seeing there, and we have a talk today about one of the Middle East unicorns, Karim, that if you actually tackle a real need in the Middle East, you kind of actually have an easy sailing because other competitors aren't really interested. So Karim does like ride sharing, and I think they were really successful, and one of the reasons was that Uber and other competitors weren't really focused on the Middle East at that time. So now they're very heavily competitive, but if you satisfy a basic need, you will get like some easy sailing because others won't, like Google won't like fight you in the Middle East. Facebook won't do that. It's just too small and no one really cares, and it's too hard. That if you're local and if you're patient and if the problem is really important, the opportunities exist and the unicorns can still happen in the Middle East. So, but kind of like from this story and kind of these two perspectives about the Middle East, I want to kind of leave you with some learnings I learned along the way doing this. So it's like, if I had started again, if you would start it, what would you kind of do right? And one of the things, I mean, again, to the stereotypes, if the Middle East is a desert, you have to be a camel, right? If you think about the camel, a camel is a very patient kind of animal that is well adapted to its environment and very efficient, right? So a camel can survive like on very kind of small amounts of water for a long time, is very well adapted, and this is really how you have to be in the Middle East. And I think one of the mistakes I did and others did is really think like, you read all these American kind of blogs and stuff like this, and like, oh, just guys, you raised the Series A of $2 million or whatever, and then you think like, I'll do that, right? I'll just go with the pitch deck and I'll raise. But you really have to be very patient and very efficient in all your resources to really make it until the end. And one of the key things which I touched upon is really delivering painkillers and not vitamins. And I think this is really important for any business to really solve a problem and not something that is not really. But in the Middle East, where you have so little runway in terms of like funding and so little time and so little purchasing power of customers, it's really important to focus on solving real pains. So solving transportation, which is a real pain for everybody, education, kind of like employment, or like housing. So these kinds of like core human problems that affect everyone are really the problems you need to solve if you're thinking about starting in the Middle East. And one of the most important things is to really be focused again. So there's a lot of, because the ecosystem is so new, there's a lot of distractions there. You see like a lot of conferences and meetups and stuff like this where you really can lose the focus. And a lot of guys you meet, like there's like these kind of fake entrepreneurs, right? You meet them at every meetup, they're always there, but they're not building everyone. And like there is like an ecosystem that sustains that, right? Because everyone is calling like himself an entrepreneur, and then you discover he hasn't left his job or is like just doing this on the side or something like that. So to really get real business, you have to have that real focus. And a kind of the last thing I really want to maybe tell myself and tell other Egyptians and tell you is really, it's very easy to be jaded in the Middle East, right? It's very easy to open the news today and kind of see all the stuff happening, all the wars, all the fighting, and it gets really kind of like weird, like Kafkaesque. I don't understand what happens in the Middle East when I read the news, but it's really important to stay optimistic. There are these opportunities and they exist, and you know they exist, but do you have the patience and the kind of like being able to do it again and again and try again, and don't be jaded about the opportunities in the Middle East. There's a lot of opportunity and there's a lot of potential to be unleashed in the Middle East, and I think I encourage myself, I encourage everyone here to think about the Middle East in these terms. There is a lot of opportunities. So kind of like a good note to finish the presentation. I think I spoke too quickly, but I hope you liked it, and if you have any questions, I would love to answer.
Any questions? Yes, please. Why Germany?
Why Germany?
Sorry, can you use the microphone for that?
So the question was why Germany, and that's an interesting question. I'll try to answer it for me, and I'll try to answer it for the rest of the people coming to Germany. For me, I think there was also a lot of interesting vibe coming of the Berlin ecosystem, and I've like you read about companies like SoundCloud at that time was doing quite well. I don't know how they're doing right now, but there were a lot of like good vibes coming from there. And for Egypt and the Middle East, it's not quite far away, so it's like a 4 or 5 hour flight, which is great. And actually, I didn't know, so when I had an interview with Zalando, I didn't know how big Zalando is. I was just like, Zalando, okay, what's this company? And then it's like, whoa, it's like, this is huge. So I think actually Berlin can even do better in terms of like showing real success stories, because there are a lot of real success stories. For the Egyptian and kind of Middle East community in general, I think Germany kind of now offers a very easy path to immigration for talent. As opposed to places which were traditionally like the US and the UK. And I think you're seeing that with not only people from the Middle East, but also people from India coming here, because I think a lot of other opportunities elsewhere are not as attractive as they are, which is a very good competitive advantage to be here in Germany, to be honest. You can really attract good talent from other countries. You're seeing from Ukraine, from Egypt, at like with ease. If you were in the US, it would have been much, much harder for you to attract them. So.
Yes, please.
What would persuade you to go back to Egypt and try again?
That's an interesting question. I think about it all the time. I think the first thing is understanding that there are real opportunities. So if I see a real opportunity in the Middle East and think about it, I would potentially go back. And there's always the family factor, right? So you come here, I have a family, I have children, I get them here. The question you always ask yourself, will I be here forever or will I go back home? I think you always think about that, and then there's a kind of a pro and con analysis. I think for now, a lot of people see a lot of pros in coming here, but I think as the region stabilizes, as we see more success stories from companies around the region, people will come back and will have the experience that they gained here to apply in the Middle East, which I think is cool.
If you stay in the Middle East, what would you do?
Right, what would I do now? I would apply all these learnings. So I, I think I would really find a core problem and kind of focus on that, and kind of think also, one of the things I didn't mention, I wanted to put a slide on it, but good that you asked me, is basically, it's very dangerous to think local in the Middle East. And I think many of the startups that started specifically in Egypt and Lebanon thought a lot about local. And there isn't much of a local market in these countries, right? So think like Egypt has 100 million people, right? But there's a very small local market. Same for the UAE, which is like also in terms of purchasing power, there are a lot of people, but the number of people is so small, right? So you have to think regional in the Middle East from day one. You have to think that I'm launching across the Middle East. And if you have something that kind of like solves a problem for people in 22 countries, then you really have an opportunity. But you shouldn't think local. So this is maybe a learning I didn't put here, is like think out of the local from day one, because a lot of people say act local, think global, and this kind of stuff. But I think you should think regional from day one in the Middle East.
Yes. How important is the geopolitical tension in the Middle East for the business? Like there's a lot of market there. It's not like uniform, right? There's Israel, there's Saudi, all these countries. How important is this geopolitical situation to go global?
Right. I'll try to answer that question. So I think it has effects, especially in the last period where there were like very big geopolitical changes. And you're seeing that the Middle East is kind of changing its skin. There's a lot of very big changes happening. And of course, if you do, as I said, like trade or things across geographies, then of course you have to understand these kind of geopolitical things, and they're very important. And I think a key for success is that you understand these kind of key regional factors. So starting a company in Egypt is probably different than starting a company in Saudi Arabia, where you have to have a legal entity that looks different, that's different than the UAE. So I think success requires that you have some street smart of like the difference between countries and picking where you kind of have your fight. So I hope that answers your question in a way.
How do you see yourself and your colleagues from either Egypt or from the Middle East? How they are competing in the market, either in the field of IT or other fields, despite all the difficulties and troubles they are facing here until, for example, they get stabilized in their job or in their country. For example, the difficulties they are facing in speaking the language and all stuff.
Yes. That's a good question. So I'm actually surprised at the level of good talent coming out of Egypt. So when I was in Egypt, I thought Egypt didn't have a lot of good engineers. And I came here and said, like, this Egyptian guy on my team is quite good. And that's like, that Egyptian guy is also good. Like, where were these guys, like, when I was in Egypt? And I'm surprised in a happy way of the level of competitiveness that people from the Middle East specifically have been showing here. So I think there's good engineering talent specifically coming out of Egypt and other countries, and people are really focused on making it here. And I think people who work with Middle Eastern colleagues are starting to see that these colleagues are like effective contributors and are as good as anyone else. So I'm happy with what I saw from my Egyptian and Arab colleagues.
Hey man, I just want to say good talk, first of all, great talk. And I want to say that, like you, I'm also Middle Eastern. I came from Lebanon. I also had a startup, and I came here, and I also believe, like, to add on to all the points that were asked, that there's a lot of brain drain. Everyone goes abroad, like you do, like me, like everyone else. But the important thing I see is that we all go back one day and implement all these things that we're learning, and to teach and to kind of. It grows the culture as well, so these changes are important for our countries in some sense. So I agree with everything you're saying.
Thank you.
I'm hoping you go back one day.
I hope so. I think not everyone will go back, but a percentage will definitely go back one day. And I think these people will have experiences they could not have seen in the Middle East, which will add a lot of value to the Middle East. So, yeah. Cool. So, but then we take this guy because you also wanted to ask. Yes.
So that was just, you know that startups in Germany used to have a reputation of copycats and stuff like that.
Right.
They have like pros and cons and defaults. But what do you think German startups in the tech industry could use as inspiration from companies in Egypt?
That's what would the people here in Germany. So the first thing to answer your question, I don't think copycatting is bad. So when I came, also I had this kind of ideas like, like copycats in Berlin, they copy all the ideas. I think you should always focus on building a business. If building a business is just copying another idea that worked in another geography, that's completely fair, right? So what's the value of creating a unique idea that fails, right? So whatever. So I don't think it's bad to copy. So So yes, but I think Germany or Berlin is past that phase, right? We're seeing local innovations that are not just copies, that are maybe better than something else. So that's great. But what would Germany learn from the Middle East? I think one of the things you should learn is that it's like, or maybe could help, is that it's really harder. So I imagine any kind of someone here who's starting a startup saying it's really difficult, and I know that starting a startup is really difficult. I've done it for 3 years. But also in these countries, it's really, really difficult because you're not just fighting the business, you're fighting everything in life to get it done. So I think people should understand the privilege here that they have and the opportunities, and kind of like work very hard to make it happen. That's my piece of advice. You said?
I was wondering if some of the virtues you talked about, like being mindful about your resources and being patient about things, some of the learnings you took from Egypt give you an advantage over maybe your German colleagues at your
I mean, not me specifically, but I think in general what you see that a lot of migrant entrepreneurs really succeed in different countries. Like in the US, the people who founded WhatsApp and others usually came from migrant background. And I think like, seeing things the hard way, and like how then when you come into an environment where it's not that hard, you kind of have the patience and have the persistence that someone who was completely raised in this environment didn't kind of see. So I think it gives you an advantage of seeing that. But I think the advice I said is also like unique to every entrepreneur. Like you always have to manage your resources. You always have to be patient. You always have to be optimistic. I think in the Middle East you have to do that much even more. But that you have to always do these things wherever you are. So cool. I think you want to take a break or. No, I don't want to talk. If there are no other questions.
Question actually, like, what happened to UserTalk? Is it still there, or?
Well, the website is there. We had a funny situation, so right now I'm trying to close down the company legally in Egypt, which is a talk that I can have like spend 2 hours on. So it's like starting a company is much easier than closing it in the Middle East. So like, calling the lawyer and like some tax stuff and stuff. So the website is there and it's functional. But we never kind of like, it never reached escape velocity. So by the time I had left, it was just budding. So I never kind of took it up. So you can log to it. I don't know if it really works or not. So it's called getusertalk.com. Just try it out. I think it doesn't really work, but you can try it out. And so there's something I wanted to say just to add to that. It's basically, I thought one of the biggest mistakes I made personally is I thought I can like balance it. I said like, let me come to Germany, have a job, and also like work on my startup as a side thing. Like I had a few guys in Egypt, and then we'll make it happen. And this kind of, if you are a startup founder and you think like that, then your startup is dead. If you really think that you can do a job and do something on the side, then you are like truly lying to yourself. You can say I will do this for a while just to like test it and do it. But like to think that the startup like would work while you're not focused 150% is really. I wasted 1 year just fooling around and doing this and try to sell it and try to do something. I would have been more truthful to myself if I said like I left Egypt, close it now, and then put that behind me. So cool. Well, thanks guys.